And so if you have your Bibles, you can go there. We're kind of going to be flipping around between chapter 1 and chapter 2 this morning. But if you know me, you know that I wasn't raised a Maritimer. I was raised partially in Quebec, but I consider myself an Ontario kid. And so with that, obviously, I, like all other Ontarians, realize and understand that, yes, we are the center of the universe, but you know, I love the Maritimes too. I'm a convert. I think Ontarians are crazy if they think that Canada ends after Ontario. But I was raised up in Ontario, and I definitely did have that mindset. And one of the things about me is, so I wasn't raised near the ocean, and so for me, seafood and anything from the ocean was just weird. It was gross. It was disgusting. My family, we didn't like seafood other than my dad, right? Everyone in my family, seafood was gross. We didn't really go near it. And so I didn't have much seafood growing up. Ontario, we have a lot of lakes. So I did grow up, I love bass fishing, but I still think bass are gross. So so basically anything, if it came from water, I wasn't interested. This is really just my way of saying, if you ever have me over and there's seafood, I'm sorry. I don't know if I can handle it. But then I came to Kingswood, who knows, 8 years ago now. It feels like forever, but actually 9 years ago now. I came to Kingswood, and I started meeting a bunch of Maritimers, because it's in Sussex, New Brunswick, and so there's a lot of kids from the Maritimes, and they all love seafood. And I met people who, came from Grand Manan, where lobster is king. And I started meeting all these people that love seafood. I also learned that, people are crazy enough that they're even it's awesome, too, is you take that seaweed out of the ocean, you dry that sucker up, throw a pound of salt on it, you got a great dinner. That stuff is disgusting. Yeah, I've tried it. It's awful. I just don't get it. I don't get seafood. But I started to learn more about different ways to cook, and so I was with a friend, and they were having crab. And now there's this myth, I don't know if it's real or not, but they say, some people say for crab, when you boil it, you put it in the pot cold water, and you slowly build up the temperature. And as it gets hotter and hotter and starts boiling, if the crab's alive, it doesn't struggle, it doesn't try to get out, because you trick it into thinking that it's not actually dying. All right, so there's debate as to whether or not that actually is true. Most people just throw it in the boiling pot of water and get it over with. But there are people out there who they put the crab in the cold pot of water, and then they slowly build up the temperature, and they say that it doesn't struggle, it doesn't try to get out. And they claim that if you were to throw it in the boiling pot and you didn't have a lid on it, it would just try to climb right out, and it would get out of the pot. And so I don't know how accurate that is. I don't know if any of you believe that. I know I was asking around. It's kind of 50-50. People believe it. But it does paint an interesting picture. It paints a picture of kind of how humans relate to sin. Right? It's often a slow burn. You don't wake up one morning and decide to rob a bank. There's a thought process. Some thinking goes into it. Although sometimes you see stuff in the news that it kind of looks like they just woke up and decided to rob a bank, because there are some really dumb criminals out there. But typically, when we fall into sin, it's a slow burn. It's a process, right? We start with something small. In our brain, we start to rationalize. Well, it's not that bad if I just do this, or I need this. Or, well, as long as we don't go this far, we've done nothing wrong. Here's the line. Let's just get as close to it as possible, and then we'll stop. As long as we stay on this side, we won't do anything wrong. And so it's a slow burn towards sin, and then before we know it, the pot is boiling, and we're surrounded, and we're drowning, and we don't know what to do. And so how does this happen? It happens so often, not to just new Christians or non-Christians, but people who've been Christians their whole lives. It happens to us, and even though we know the truth about God, we know that He loves us, we know that He wants what's best for us, we still fall into sin. And so sin usually takes root when we want to do something we know God doesn't want us to do, but still we take the time to rationalize it. And eventually we give in and we do it. And I don't know if you guys are like me, but when I was a kid, anytime I did something wrong, anytime I got in trouble, the first thing I did was, I promise I'll never do it again. Never, ever. Right? Like, I used to be a menace with scissors. If I ever got a hold of scissors, something was getting cut. My hair. But the big one I remember, like my brother's blocker for like road hockey. All kinds of stuff. But the big one I remember, every time, I promise, I'll never do it again. But the big one I remember that got me in a lot of trouble is my dad. He's always been a big barbecue man. Right now we have the Weber Genesis. If you know your barbecues, it's a good barbecue. And but he had this barbecue cover that was made of leather. And I just cut that thing up, made a big hole in it, and they were not happy. And so to this day, now I don't get in trouble, but to this day, like, I'll just cut pieces of paper randomly. I don't know why. I just like scissors and cutting stuff. But when I knew it was wrong and it was stuff that wasn't mine, I guess I wanted to see, what happens if I cut this? And I knew it was wrong, and I kept promising I'll never do it again, but I kept doing it, and I kept disobeying my parents. Because I rationalized it. I was like, well, no one cares if I cut just a tiny little piece of the corner, right? Like, they won't even notice. Or if I cut just one piece of my hair, like, my mom's not going to notice. Or, my brother's blocker, like, who actually uses a blocker in road hockey? I'll just cut, like, a tiny little bit. But then the cut gets a little bigger, and a little bigger, and a little bigger. And then before you know it, I've cut, like, half of the barbecue cover into a million pieces. And so we rationalize, and eventually we give in. And we promise never to do it again. But once the sin's been tried once, the temptation to repeat increases. And so we find it harder and harder to stay away. So we stay in the pot, just like the crab. Even though we should be jumping out, we should be getting out, we know the water's getting warmer, but we just kind of sit, we're comfortable. We should be jumping out, we should be living the life that God offers us, but we just don't. And that's true for all sin. I don't know about you, but it's once you kind of start a lie, it may start as a little white lie, it's easier to kind of expand on that, and it gets bigger and bigger. Or if you start looking at stuff on the computer you shouldn't be looking at. The first time you feel you're paranoid, you're looking everywhere. And then it gets easier and easier because every time you go back, you know it's still there waiting for you. And the temptation increases. And so in Genesis, the very beginning of the Bible, first thing we learn is God created the world. And He created it, and He made us to inhabit it. And so if we were to go back and take a walk in the Garden of Eden for a moment, God created the world because He desired a relationship with humanity. He wanted to interact with us. He wanted to communicate with us. He wanted to have a relationship, not just create us and walk away. There's a lot of people in the world that believe that God's kind of like this overarching God. He kind of looks down, He's angry, and He's not really talking to us. He's just kind of ignoring us, and He's just waiting for the day when He can throw us all in hell because we didn't do good enough. But God wanted a relationship. He wanted to talk to us. We see Him talking to Adam, talking to Eve while He's there. He's giving them instructions. So He created Adam and Eve, and He placed them in the Garden of Eden, this wonderful place, right? They describe it in the Bible. It's amazing. It sounds like the most beautiful place in the world. And this was a place where all their needs were met. Everything was wonderful. They had all the food, all the shelter, all the water, everything they needed. And He gave them freedom to move around as they please. He said, you can do whatever you want, just one rule. And if you've read the Bible, you know the rule. Don't eat from one tree. There's just one. You got millions, thousands of trees. You can go eat from anything else, just this one tree. Don't eat from it. And so they had every reason not to eat from that tree. And at first they didn't eat from the tree. They held off. We don't know exactly how long, right? But we know Adam's first job was to name all the animals. And there's a lot of animals. That probably took a little bit of time. And so he was going around. And eventually they kept looking at that tree. I can only imagine them just walking by every day. First day, you kind of ignore it completely. Doesn't matter. We don't need that tree. Second day, you kind of look around. You're like, okay, I see you there. You're still there. Third, fourth, fifth day, you keep going. The tree starts to look better. You're like, I'm getting kind of tired of eating kale. No one likes kale, really. Those apples, though, those look good. Man. And they don't even really know what an apple tastes like. They just made up the word the day before because they finally got around to naming it. So they're not even sure, but it just looks better and better. And finally, they give in to that temptation. And so God, He didn't desire them to eat that apple. Obviously, in His ideal world, we never would have eaten from the tree. Because God's desire for us is life. God desires us to have life, not death. And so we're going to go into Romans chapter 1. We're going to start at verse 29. And we're going to see where Paul is talking. He's talking to the Romans, and he's talking about this idea that God desires to give us life. And so Romans, if you don't know, it was written by Paul. He was an apostle. He's writing to the church of Rome. And he's telling them about how God loved all people from the beginning, but they all turned away from him. If we see that, that's really the theme of the Old Testament, is the Israelites. They come to God, they run away. They come to God, they run away. It's the most frustrating story to read ever, because you're just bashing your head saying, why can't you get it? And so our whole lives, human race, God has always loved us. That's never changed, but we continually have turned away from him. And so a question I see asked over and over again by both young and older people is, if we know God, why do we keep on sinning? It's a question I ask myself. If I know God, why am I choosing to sin? If we know what God desires for us, we know that he desires to give us life, why are we choosing death? Why are we choosing to turn away from him? And this was one of the big questions that Paul was addressing to the Romans. So it says, Romans 1:29, they have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, no mercy. Not a good start. And although they know God's righteous decree, so they know what God wants for them. They know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death. They not only continue to do these very things, but also approve of those who practice them. And so the church at this time that he was writing to was not in a good state. They were not doing well. And there was all kinds of sin creeping in. And what's incredible is the book before this, Acts. All you read about is the explosion of the church, these amazing things that are happening. And so just not long before this, we saw so many good things. God had done many incredible things. The Holy Spirit was expanding across the world, and it was just doing these incredible things. We were seeing miracles like the likes that not even Jesus had done while he was on earth. And so these people knew that God desired to give them life, and yet that slow burn, they started to allow sin to creep in, and they let things get bigger and bigger and bigger until they were drowning in their sin. They were in the boiling pot. And if we read this passage, a lot of people who have been hurt by the church or aren't in the church and are critical of Christians, we hear a lot of those words said about Christians today. And I don't believe that's true about the majority of them. But these are things that are coming in and creeping into the church. These are some of these things that we struggle with. What are some of these sins that are the hardest to avoid? We've got envy, deceit, gossip, arrogant, boastful, disobeying their parents, have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, no mercy. Some of those things we still struggle with today. And we know that God desires to give us life. But it's sometimes just so hard to follow him. It's so hard to remember that God desires to give us life. And the second thing is, and we know this truth, that no matter how good sin feels, it will eventually lead to death. That is another truth we know. And we all like to think that we know sin is wrong, and we have the power to say no. I mean, I know in my life I've had many times where I've been boastful or arrogant enough to think that I can say no. I don't need to say yes to that, especially in high school in particular. And we think we know where to draw the line, and we can back off. And then when we get too close, we think, that'll be good. We'll get to the line, we'll get too close, and then we'll just stop. But that's not how sin works. And it's usually more like this. A sin lures you in. You convince yourself that everything's fine. A little sin won't seriously hurt anything. You start to rationalize. You say, the Bible was written a long time ago. Some of the stuff, like culturally, has changed. Our culture is different now. The Bible was written for that culture. Our culture does things this way. And so, really, I'm not sinning at all because, in our culture, this is totally normal. Everyone does it. And so we start to slowly make those rationalizations. And we start to cross the line and we think, a little sin won't hurt anything. But this mindset and behavior, it eventually leads to more and more sin. And it eventually leads to death. And so if we think back to the Garden of Eden for a minute, most of you, I'm sure, know how that ends up. It's not good. And often people make the joke, they blame Adam, or more so guys like to blame Eve and blame women. It's a bad old joke. But honestly, I don't think that that's the truth. I mean, blaming Adam, blaming Eve for your sin and the fact that you deal with sin and all the sin in the world. Honestly, if it hadn't have been them, it would have been the next person. It would have been one of us. It could have been any of us. Because we know that the only person on earth who never sinned was Jesus. And so we've all dealt with sin in our life. We've all struggled with it. And so we like to blame and condemn others for their actions. Because we love looking at other people and saying, well, clearly they're in the wrong. We love looking at others and saying, well, they're doing this and this and this wrong, and they need to get that right. Meanwhile, we're ignoring our own sin. We ignore the plank in our own eye. And the Romans did this same thing too. If we go over to Romans chapter 2, and you go to verse 1, you're going to see here that the Romans, rather than confess to their sin and say, you're right, Paul, we did wrong, we need to improve, we need to get this sin out of our life, they start to say, well, what about these guys? So then here's what Paul says in verse 1, chapter 2. You therefore have no excuse, you who pass judgment on someone else. For at whatever point you judge another, you are condemning yourself, because you who pass judgment do the same things. Now we know that God's judgment against those who do such things is based on truth. So when you, a mere human being, pass judgment on them, and yet do the same thing, do you think you will escape God's judgment? Or do you show contempt for the riches of his kindness, forbearance and patience, not realizing that God's kindness is intended to lead you to repentance? So we see here that he's telling them, you've got no excuse. When you pass judgment on others, you are just condemning yourself. Who are you, God? You're a mere human. And yet, you're passing judgment when you do the same things. And so one of the hardest parts, I think, about being Christian or becoming a Christian, I think the hardest hurdle to get over, and before I came here, when I was at Kingswood, I traveled on summer teams, and I've worked in camp ministry my whole life. And I've encountered this time and time again, and it's one of the most frustrating things as a leader, because you know that the answer isn't simple. But it's admitting that you're a sinner. And so often I've run into teens and adults that just don't want to admit that. They don't want to admit that they've done something wrong. They think, well, I'm a good person. I give to charity. I spend my money wisely. I don't hoard everything. I help others when they need help. I helped my friend move in last week. I mean, who does that, right? And so one of the hardest parts is admitting we're a sinner, that we're wrong, and that we haven't done what's right. The word sinner, it seems so degrading. When you say that word, there's almost a visual response on people's face. They don't like it. It's degrading. And so we shove it off onto others. We fail to recognize our own shortcomings. We start to blame others. Because we'd rather tell ourselves, oh, we're not that bad. I'm not that bad. And, if you compare me to Johnny, he's got tons of issues. I'm great compared to him. And so we start to do the comparison game. And well, so-and-so did this, and that's such an awful thing to do, and I'd never do that. And we tell ourselves that we're safe as long as we aren't the worst person around or are making the worst decisions. But judging others, it doesn't make us any better, and it definitely doesn't put us any closer to God. If anything, it puts us in danger of being worse off because we are failing to recognize our own need for God to help us. The reality is the only standard we're measured against is God. And by that standard, we're deserving of death. We're not going to measure up to God. It's impossible. But even from the beginning, God's made what is wrong right, because he wants to have a relationship with us. And nothing we do, no matter what we compare ourselves with, can ever change the fact that God loves us. And so the last point is God is patient and kind because he doesn't want our sin to lead us to death. So it's an awesome thing that God is so patient, he's so kind. Because I think that as a whole, humans, we're kind of stubborn. Or at least I can speak for myself. I can be stubborn. And some of us more than others. But we're all guilty of doing things that bring more harm than good. In the moment, it feels right. It looks right. It sounds right. But we can use those assurances to hush away the warning signs. But Paul says there's a day we'll all be judged according to the law. And not one of us has been able to keep the law. We're all guilty. And so God is going to judge us. And there is no sin that comes without consequence. No sin committed without a price to pay. And so whatever the sin is, there's a price to be paid. Not just for you, but for those around you who maybe didn't do anything wrong. But we live in a world where we like to trick ourselves into thinking we can sit in the pot of slowly boiling water and continue sinning without getting burnt. Because we think we can handle it. But the big difference between knowing what is right and doing what is right is there is a huge difference between those two. There's a big difference between knowing what honors God and choosing to do what honors God. There's a life and death difference between knowing Jesus died on the cross and believing that he died on the cross because your sin put him there. And so this morning, it's just a simple truth. We need Jesus to save us from our sin. Admitting we're sinners is only half the solution. We need Jesus to help us, to step in and take our place. Because if you've trusted Jesus to get you out of the boiling pot, God sees you as pure and holy. He doesn't see that sin. He sees you as one without sin because Jesus took on the penalty of death so that you wouldn't have to. And that's something not to be taken for granted.